The anniversary card arrived on the morning I turned 67, slipped under my front door like a secret someone couldn't bear to deliver face to face. Plain white envelope, no return address, just my name written in handwriting that made my coffee cup slip from my fingers and shatter across the kitchen floor. Ruth. I knew that writing. Every careful loop of the R, every slanted T that never quite touched the line. David used to leave me notes tucked inside my library books during the early years of our marriage. Missing you already, scrawled on napkins. Don't forget you're beautiful, written on the back of grocery receipts. I hadn't seen his handwriting in 18 years, not since they found his car abandoned by Silver Creek, with his wallet, his wedding ring, and a note that simply said, "I'm sorry." The card was generic watercolor roses with gold script that read, "Thinking of you today." But inside, in that unmistakable handwriting, were the words that stopped my breath. "Happy anniversary, Ruth. I never really left. Check the attic." I dropped the card like it had caught fire. My legs gave out, and I sank into the kitchen chair where I'd eaten breakfast alone for nearly 2 decades, staring at those impossible words. David Montgomery, my husband, the man I'd buried in an empty coffin, while our daughter Sarah sobbed into my shoulder, was telling me he'd never left. The police had called it suicide. The creek was high that spring, they said. Sometimes bodies get carried downstream and never surface. We held a memorial service where I sat in the front pew, wearing the black dress I'd bought for my mother's funeral, accepting condolences from neighbors who whispered about the tragedy of a man in his prime taking his own life. For 18 years, I'd lived with the guilt, wondering what signs I'd missed, what words I should have said, how I'd failed the man I'd loved since I was 22 years old. Now, staring at the card with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, I understood that everything I'd believed about my marriage, my grief, my life had been built on a lie. David wasn't dead. He was somewhere out there, living some other existence, while I'd spent nearly 2 decades as a widow, who wasn't really a widow, mourning a man who'd simply chosen to disappear. I forced myself to stand, my knees creaking like old floorboards. The attic. He wanted me to go to the attic. I hadn't been up there in years, couldn't face sorting through the boxes of Christmas decorations and childhood mementos that David and I had stored together during happier times. But now, it was calling to me like a siren song I couldn't ignore. The attic ladder groaned under my weight as I climbed, flashlight gripped tight in my sweating palm. The air up there was thick and dusty, filled with the ghost scents of mothballs and old wood. My flashlight beam swept across familiar shapes draped in yellowing sheets until it caught something that didn't belong. In the far corner, behind a stack of Sarah's old school projects, was a wooden crate I'd never seen before. Inside that crate was evidence of a life I'd never known existed. Bank statements under the name Michael Sterling. Photographs of David with a dark-haired woman and 2 young children, all of them laughing on a beach I didn't recognize. Driver's licenses, insurance cards, even a birth certificate for a child born 3 years after David supposedly drowned. The woman in the photos was younger than me, prettier, with the kind of effortless smile I'd lost somewhere in the middle of our marriage. I sat there in the dusty attic, surrounded by the debris of my carefully constructed widowhood, holding proof that my husband hadn't died. He'd simply traded me in for a newer model and let me believe he was dead rather than face the messy reality of divorce. The grief I thought I'd finally learned to carry transformed into something sharper, more dangerous. This wasn't loss anymore. This was betrayal in its purest, most calculated form. Back in 1987, if you'd asked me to describe my marriage to David Montgomery, I would have painted you a picture of contentment. We lived in a modest 2-story house on Maple Street in Millbrook, Oregon, where the mountains rose like protective walls around our quiet valley town. David worked as an insurance adjuster, steady work that kept him traveling 3 days a week, but always brought him home to me by Friday evening. I was the head librarian at Millbrook Public Library, A job I'd held for 15 years and loved with the quiet passion of someone who understood that books could heal wounds that people couldn't reach. We'd met at a church potluck when I was 22, and he was 25, both of us shy and awkward, bonding over our shared love of mystery novels and our mutual terror of the church ladies who kept trying to set us up with other people. David was gentle, then soft-spoken, with calloused hands from weekend carpentry projects and eyes that crinkled at the corners when he laughed. He courted me with old-fashioned patience, bringing me wildflowers picked from the roadside and worn paperback books he'd found in used shops during his travels. Our wedding was small, held in the church fellowship hall, with my mother's friends providing the food and Sarah's grandmother playing piano. David wore his father's suit altered to fit his broader shoulders, and I wore my grandmother's pearls with a simple white dress I'd sewn myself. We honeymooned at the Oregon coast, spending 3 days in a cabin that smelled like cedar and salt air, walking the beach at sunset, and talking about the children we'd have, the life we'd build together. For the first 10 years, we were happy in the quiet way that ordinary people are happy. We established routines that felt like prayers. Sunday morning pancakes while reading the paper together. Friday night movies rented from the video store. Saturday morning yard work, followed by lunch on the porch. David built me bookshelves for every room of the house, sturdy oak shelves that still hold my collection of mysteries and romances. I learned to cook his mother's pot roast recipe and grew tomatoes in the garden he tilled for me each spring. Sarah came along in our 7th year of marriage, a surprise that transformed David from a quiet, cautious man into someone who sang lullabies at 3 a.m. and built elaborate blanket forts in the living room. I watched him teach her to ride a bicycle in our driveway, running alongside her with his hand on the small of her back, ready to catch her if she fell. Those were the golden years when our house felt full of love and possibility, when I believed we'd grow old together in matching rocking chairs, sharing the comfortable silence of people who'd learned each other's rhythms by heart. The trouble started so gradually, I almost missed it. Small things at first. David coming home later from his business trips, claiming traffic or difficult clients. Phone calls that stopped abruptly when I entered the room. A new cologne I didn't recognize, expensive and musky, nothing like the simple aftershave he'd worn for years. When I asked about it, he said it was a sample from a hotel, but something in his eyes flickered when he said it like a candle flame in a draft. He began working longer hours, taking assignments that kept him away for weeks instead of days. The insurance company was expanding, he said, and they needed experienced adjusters to handle the bigger cases. The money was good, better than we'd ever had, but it came at the cost of David's presence. Dinners became a solitary affair, Sarah and I eating while David's plate grew cold in the microwave. The weekend projects stopped. The Sunday morning pancakes became Sarah and me eating cereal while David slept and claiming exhaustion from his travels. I told myself it was a phase. Every marriage had seasons, I reasoned, times when work demanded more and family had to wait. I focused on Sarah, on my job at the library, on the small satisfactions of keeping our household running smoothly. I organized the church bake sale, volunteered at Sarah's school, maintained the garden David no longer helped me tend. I became very good at filling the spaces his absence created, so good that I almost convinced myself I didn't miss him. But I did miss him. I missed the man who used to surprise me with coffee and a muffin during my lunch break at the library. I missed the conversations we'd have while folding laundry together, sharing stories about our days, making plans for the weekend. I missed the weight of his hand on my shoulder when I stood at the kitchen sink, the way he'd kiss the top of my head without thinking about it. I missed feeling like half of something complete instead of a whole person trying to be enough for everyone. The worst part wasn't his physical absence. It was the way he was absent even when he was home. He'd sit at the dinner table scrolling through his phone, responding to questions with grunts and half-formed sentences. He stopped asking about my day, stopped sharing details about his trips beyond the basic logistics of when he'd be leaving and when he'd return. We became strangers, sharing a mortgage, and a child polite and careful with each other, like houseguests, afraid of overstaying their welcome. I remember the exact moment I realized I was losing him, though I didn't understand then how completely he was already gone. It was Sarah's 9th birthday, and I'd spent the entire day preparing her favorite meal and decorating the dining room with purple streamers and balloons. David had promised to be home by 4 o'clock, swore he wouldn't miss it this time after failing to show up for her school play the month before. Sarah kept checking the clock, her excitement dimming with each passing hour. At 6 o'clock, I lit the candles on her birthday cake and sang to her alone, watching her brave little smile crack around the edges. David arrived at 8:30 with a gift wrapped in drugstore paper and an excuse about a conference call that ran long. Sarah was already in her pajamas, the excitement of her special day reduced to a few obligatory photos and a hurried hug goodnight. I stood in the kitchen washing dishes while David disappeared into his home office, supposedly to finish some paperwork. But really, I suspected to avoid the disappointment in my eyes. That night, after Sarah was asleep, I knocked on his office door. We needed to talk about this pattern, about how his work was consuming our family life. But when I opened the door, he was on the phone speaking in a voice I didn't recognize. Soft, intimate, careful. I heard him say, "I miss you too," before he noticed me standing there and abruptly hung up. When I asked who he was talking to, he said it was a colleague in Portland discussing a case, but his face had flushed red and he couldn't meet my eyes. I should have pressed him then. Should have demanded answers, insisted on honesty. Instead, I backed away from the door and went to bed alone, pulling the covers up to my chin and staring at the ceiling until dawn. Some part of me already knew what I was too afraid to confront. David was slipping away from us, and I was letting him go rather than fight for what we'd built together. The pattern continued for 3 more years. David's absences grew longer, his presence at home more distracted and distant. He missed Sarah's 6th grade graduation, her first school dance, the Christmas pageant where she played Mary. Each absence was explained with workplace urgency, each apology delivered with less conviction than the last. I stopped making his favorite meals, stopped waiting up for him to come home from trips, stopped reaching for his hand during movies we watched in silence. By the time Sarah started high school, we were living like roommates who shared financial obligations, but little else. David had his own checking account, his own credit cards, his own secrets that he guarded like precious stones. I had my job, my books, my garden, and a daughter who'd learned not to expect much from her father. We were a family in name, only held together by habit and mutual avoidance of difficult conversations. Looking back now, I can see how carefully David orchestrated his exit from our lives. It wasn't a sudden abandonment, but a gradual withdrawal, like a tide pulling back so slowly you don't notice until you're standing on dry sand. He was training us to live without him, preparing us for his eventual disappearance, even as he planned to let us believe he was dead. The cruelty of it still takes my breath away. The final betrayal came on what would be our last wedding anniversary together, though I didn't know it then. October 15th, 2005. I'd made reservations at Giuseppe's, the same Italian restaurant where we'd had our first official date 23 years earlier. I bought a new dress, navy blue with tiny pearl buttons, and made an appointment to have my hair done. It felt important to try to make one last effort to bridge the chasm that had opened between us. David forgot. Not just the dinner reservation, but the anniversary itself. When I reminded him that morning, already dressed and ready to go, he looked at me with genuine confusion before the recognition dawned in his eyes. "Shit, Ruth. I'm sorry. I have a client dinner tonight. Big case. Can we reschedule?" I stood there in my new dress, smelling like the perfume I'd bought specially for the occasion, and felt something inside me break cleanly in half. Not my heart, exactly. Something deeper. The last thread of hope I'd been clinging to without realizing it. "Sure," I heard myself say. "We can reschedule. but we never did. 3 weeks later, David left for what he said would be a 4-day trip to assess flood damage in Eugene. He kissed my cheek before he left, a dry, perfunctory gesture that felt more like punctuation than affection. The next morning, the police called to tell me they'd found his car. I spent the following 18 years believing I was a widow who'd somehow failed to save her husband from despair. I carried guilt like a stone in my chest, wondering if I'd been more attentive, more understanding, more something, whether David would still be alive. I went to grief counseling, joined a support group for suicide survivors, learned to speak about my loss in the careful language of healing and acceptance. But David wasn't dead. He was in Phoenix, Arizona, living under the name Michael Sterling, with a woman named Jennifer, and their 2 children playing father to kids who looked just like Sarah had at that age. He was attending soccer games and school plays, building tree houses, and teaching someone else's daughter to ride a bicycle. He was living the life he'd walked away from, just with different people who didn't know he'd ever been anyone else. The photographs I'd found in the attic told the story of his betrayal in vivid color. David teaching a little boy to fish, the same patient expression on his face that I remembered from Sarah's childhood. David at a Christmas morning scene surrounded by wrapped presents and laughing children wearing a sweater I'd never seen before. David at a wedding, his arm around Jennifer in her white dress, both of them smiling like people who believed in forever. What gutted me wasn't just that he'd replaced us. It was how happy he looked. How natural. Like stepping into this new life had been as easy as changing clothes. While I'd been drowning in guilt and grief, wondering what I'd done wrong, he'd been building a new family from scratch and apparently doing a much better job the second time around. I sat in that dusty attic until the sun set, holding evidence of my husband's second life in hands that had aged 18 years while waiting for a man who was never coming home. When I finally climbed down that ladder, I wasn't the same woman who'd climbed up. The naive, trusting, self-doubting version of Ruth had been left behind with the mothballs and Christmas decorations. What came down was someone harder, clearer, and finally angry. The transformation didn't happen overnight. For the first few days after finding David's hidden life, I moved through my daily routines like a sleepwalker making coffee. I couldn't taste watering plants. I couldn't see, smiling at library patrons while my mind churned with images of my husband's other family. I called in sick to work something I'd done maybe 5 times in 30 years and spent my days sitting in David's old chair, holding those photographs like evidence in a trial I hadn't known I was preparing for. Sarah called on Thursday evening, her weekly check-in that had become as routine as changing the calendar. She lived in Seattle now, worked as a social worker, had built a good life despite growing up with an absent father, and a mother who'd taught her that love meant accepting whatever scraps of attention you were offered. "You sound tired, Mom," she said after we'd covered the usual topics of weather and work. "Are you sleeping okay?" I almost told her then. Almost said, "Your father isn't dead, sweetheart. He's been playing house in Arizona for the past 18 years while we learned to live without him." But something held me back. Maybe it was the same protective instinct that had kept me from saying negative things about David during her childhood, even when his absences left her crying into her pillow. Or maybe I needed to understand the full scope of his betrayal before I shattered Sarah's carefully constructed understanding of our family history. "I'm fine," I lied. "Just a little under the weather." "You never get sick," she said, worry creeping into her voice. "Maybe you should see Dr. Patel." "I will if it doesn't get better soon," I promised, already planning to hang up so I could continue my quiet unraveling in private. After our call ended, I found myself drawn back to the attic like a moth to flame. I climbed those stairs again and again over the next few days, each time discovering new evidence of David's duplicity. Bank statements showed regular deposits from an insurance company in Phoenix. Credit card bills revealed a lifestyle I'd never been part of. Grocery stores I'd never shopped at, restaurants I'd never eaten, and a mortgage payment for a house I'd never seen. The most damning evidence was a life insurance policy I found buried under the financial documents. David had taken out a substantial policy on himself just 6 months before his disappearance, naming Jennifer Sterling as the beneficiary. Not his wife of 24 years, not his only daughter, but the woman he planned to build a new life with. The policy was dated April 2005, which meant he'd been planning his fake death for months, while still sharing a bed with me, still showing up at our dinner table, still pretending to be a husband and father. I spent hours staring at that policy, trying to comprehend the level of premeditation it represented. This wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of weakness. This was a carefully orchestrated exit strategy that required David to look me in the eye every day for months while planning to disappear forever. He'd calculated exactly how much I'd receive from his actual life insurance policy, enough to keep me comfortable, but not enough to make me wealthy. He'd arranged his fake death to look like suicide, knowing I'd blame myself instead of looking for answers. He'd manipulated my grief, my guilt, my love for him into a prison he could lock me in while he walked free. The rage, when it finally came, was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Not the hot, explosive anger of a moment, but something cold and methodical that settled into my bones like winter. I wasn't angry at being left, wasn't even angry at being replaced. I was angry at being erased so thoroughly that David felt comfortable sending me an anniversary card, like we were old friends, instead of a woman whose life he'd deliberately destroyed. That weekend, I drove to the library on my day off and used the computers to research everything I could find about Michael Sterling of Phoenix, Arizona. It wasn't hard to track him down. He'd been careless with his digital footprint, probably assuming that Ruth Montgomery would never look beyond her grief long enough to discover his new identity. I found his address, his employer, his children's school enrollment records. I found Jennifer's Facebook page full of family photos and cheerful updates about their perfect suburban life. They lived in a house with a swimming pool and a 3-car garage. Their children, Emma and Tyler, played soccer and took piano lessons. Jennifer posted pictures of family vacations to Disneyland and the Grand Canyon, of birthday parties and Christmas mornings that looked like magazine spreads. David appeared in these photos as Michael, graying slightly at the temples, but otherwise unchanged, smiling the same crooked smile I'd fallen in love with 30 years earlier. What struck me most was how normal they looked. How happy. There was no haunted quality to David's eyes, no sign that he was a man living with a terrible secret. He looked like what he'd always wanted to be: a devoted husband and father who'd never disappointed anyone, never broken any promises, never left anyone crying at a birthday party. He'd gotten to start over with a clean slate, while I'd spent 18 years carrying the weight of his supposed suicide. But as I scrolled through years of their documented happiness, I noticed something that made me pause. In every photo, Jennifer looked younger than I'd initially realized. Much younger. If I had to guess, she was in her early 20s when David first disappeared, which meant she was probably still a teenager when they met. The timeline was starting to make more sense. David hadn't just left his family for another woman. He'd left his family for a girl young enough to be his daughter. That revelation added another layer to my anger. Not jealousy over her youth and beauty, but fury at the pattern it revealed. David had been grooming his replacement while still married to me, probably telling Jennifer that his marriage was over in all but name, that he was only staying for his daughter's sake. He'd painted himself as a trapped, unhappy man instead of the coward he actually was. I printed everything. Every photo, every social media post, every public record I could find. I organized it all in a file folder that grew thicker by the day, building a case against a man who thought he'd covered his tracks well enough to stay hidden forever. But David had underestimated his first wife. He'd forgotten that librarians are very good at research. On Monday morning, I called in sick again and drove to the county courthouse. I'd never consulted a lawyer before, had never needed legal advice more complicated than updating my will after David's supposed death. But now, I had questions that required professional answers. Questions about bigamy insurance fraud and the legal implications of faking your own death. Margaret Chen had been practicing family law in Millbrook for 20 years, long enough to have seen every possible variation of marital betrayal. She listened to my story without interruption, occasionally taking notes on a yellow legal pad, her expression growing more serious with each detail I shared. "You understand," she said when I finished, "that what your husband did constitutes several felonies. Identity fraud, insurance fraud, filing a false police report. If you wanted to press charges, the district attorney would be very interested in this case." I leaned back in the leather chair across from her desk, considering. "What I want," I said slowly, "is for him to face consequences. Not necessarily prison, but accountability. I want him to know that his actions had real costs for real people." Margaret nodded. "We can work with that. First, we need to file paperwork declaring him legally alive, which will invalidate any death benefits you received. Then we can pursue civil remedies damages for emotional distress fraud abandonment. The evidence you've gathered is quite compelling." "There's something else," I said, pulling the anniversary card from my purse. "He contacted me. He knows I found out about his second life, and he's still playing games." Margaret examined the card, her eyebrows raising at the handwriting analysis would verify this was from him. "This changes things. By contacting you, he's essentially admitted to the fraud. We can add harassment to the list of charges." I left Margaret's office with a plan, and for the first time in weeks, a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with grief or guilt. David wanted to play games fine, but he'd forgotten that he was playing with someone who'd had 18 years to get very good at patience. The investigation moved quickly once I'd hired professionals to help. Margaret connected me with a private investigator named Tom Reeves, a retired police detective who specialized in missing persons and fraud cases. Within a week, Tom had confirmed everything I'd suspected and uncovered details that made David's betrayal even more complete. Jennifer hadn't been just young when they met. She'd been his client. Her family's house had been damaged in a flood in 2003, and David had been assigned to handle their insurance claim. She was 19, working part-time at a coffee shop while taking community college classes, when the handsome older insurance adjuster started finding excuses to visit her family's house. Tom's investigation revealed phone records showing David had been calling Jennifer's number regularly starting in early 2004, more than a year before his disappearance. "Classic pattern," Tom explained during one of our meetings at Margaret's office. "Older married man, young vulnerable woman, promises of a better life together. He probably told her his marriage was already over, that he was just waiting for the right time to leave. Then when the time came, he couldn't face the messy reality of divorce and custody battles, so he took the coward's way out." The financial picture was even more damning. David had been funneling money into secret accounts for years, small amounts that I'd never noticed missing from our household budget. He'd taken out credit cards in my name, using the credit to fund his double life, then covering the minimum payments to keep me from finding out. When he faked his death, he left me with debt I didn't know existed and insurance money that barely covered paying it off. "He planned this meticulously," Margaret said, reviewing the financial documents Tom had uncovered. "He knew exactly how much you'd need to survive but not thrive. He wanted to keep you financially stable enough that you wouldn't ask too many questions, but not comfortable enough to hire investigators or lawyers. Meanwhile, the insurance money from David's fake death had funded Michael Sterling's new life in Phoenix. He'd used my pain, my grief, my love for him as a down payment on his fresh start. Every time I'd cried at his memorial service, every time I'd visited his empty grave, every time I'd wondered what I could have done differently, David had been building a life that erased me completely. But perhaps the cruelest discovery was a letter Tom found in David's abandoned storage unit in Eugene, the one he'd been paying for monthly under his real name, even while living as Michael Sterling. The letter was addressed to me, dated the day after his disappearance, but never sent. In it, David had written what amounted to a confession, explaining that he'd fallen in love with someone else and couldn't face the pain of a traditional divorce. He'd written about his guilt, his cowardice, his hope that I'd eventually understand why he'd chosen to disappear rather than fight for our marriage. I know this seems like the cruelest option. The letter read, "But I truly believe it will be easier for you to mourn a dead husband than to hate a living one. You deserve better than I can give you, Ruth. You always have." I read that letter 3 times before the full weight of its arrogance hit me. David had decided unilaterally what would be easier for me, what I deserved, what was best for my emotional well-being. He'd stolen my choice, my voice, my right to fight for my marriage or grieve it honestly. He'd appointed himself the judge of what I could handle, then structured his disappearance to fit his assumptions about my weakness. But David had been wrong about me. Dead wrong. And now, finally, I was going to prove it. The confrontation I'd been unconsciously planning for months came together on a Tuesday morning in late November. Margaret had filed all the necessary paperwork declaring David legally alive and documenting his fraud. Tom had traced his current address and confirmed that Michael Sterling was indeed my supposedly dead husband. All that remained was deciding how to proceed. "We could handle this entirely through the courts," Margaret explained during our final planning meeting. "File charges, pursue civil damages, let the system handle the confrontation. You never have to see him again if you don't want to." I considered that option seriously. Part of me, the part that had spent 18 years being the grieving widow, wanted to stay safely behind legal paperwork and professional representatives. But there was another part of me, the part that had been growing stronger since I'd found that anniversary card, that needed to look David in the eye when his carefully constructed world collapsed. "I want to see him," I said finally. "I want him to know that the woman he tried to erase is the one who brought him down." Margaret nodded. "Then we'll arrange a meeting. Neutral territory with legal representation present. I'll contact his lawyer and set something up." It took 3 weeks to coordinate. David hired a criminal defense attorney, which told me everything I needed to know about how seriously he was taking the charges against him. The meeting was scheduled for December 15th at Margaret's office, a date that felt like cosmic justice since it was exactly 2 months after the anniversary David had forgotten. I spent those 3 weeks preparing not just legally, but emotionally. I bought a new suit, deep green wool, that made me feel professional and powerful. I had my hair cut and styled not to look younger or prettier, but to look like someone who meant business. I practiced what I wanted to say, refined it down to the essential truths I needed him to hear. The morning of the meeting, I stood in front of my bedroom mirror and saw a woman I barely recognized. Not because I looked different, but because I carried myself differently. 18 years of grief had taught me to make myself smaller, to move through the world apologetically, as if my continued existence was somehow an imposition. The woman in the mirror stood straight shoulders, back chin up. She looked like someone who knew her own worth. Margaret's office felt charged with electricity when I arrived. David was already there, sitting across from Margaret's conference table, next to a thin, nervous-looking man in an expensive suit. I took a moment to study my supposedly dead husband before he noticed me in the doorway. He'd aged, of course. His hair was more gray than brown now, and lines bracketed his eyes and mouth. He wore a blue shirt I didn't recognize, and a wedding ring that wasn't the one I'd chosen for him 30 years earlier. But he was unmistakably David, the man I'd loved, mourned, and now finally understood. When he looked up and saw me, his face went through a series of expressions so rapid, I almost missed them. Shock, fear, guilt, and finally a kind of resigned acceptance. He knew why he was here. He knew what was coming.
"Hello, David,"
I said, taking the seat directly across from him.
"You're looking well for a dead man."
His lawyer immediately started talking about settlements and minimizing exposure, but I held up a hand to stop him. "I'm not here to negotiate," I said. "I'm here so David can look at me while I tell him exactly what his cowardice cost." For the next hour, I laid out 18 years of consequences. Sarah's trust issues her struggle to maintain relationships because her father had taught her that men disappear without explanation. My own journey through guilt and grief, the years of therapy trying to understand what I'd done wrong, the way I'd shrunk my life down to the size of David's absence. The financial struggles I'd faced, the dreams I'd abandoned, the way I'd learned to apologize for taking up space in the world. David sat there and took it, his face growing paler with each detail. Once or twice he tried to interrupt to explain or justify, but his lawyer kept a restraining hand on his arm. When I finished, the room was silent except for the sound of Margaret's pen scratching across her legal pad. "That's what your easier solution actually looked like," I said finally. "That's the life you condemned me to while you played house with a teenager in Arizona." David's voice when he finally spoke was hoarse. "Ruth, I know I handled it wrong. I was scared, I was confused. I thought if I just disappeared, it would hurt less than if I asked for a divorce." "You thought?" I repeated. "You decided what would hurt less for whom for you? Because leaving wasn't easier for me, David. It was devastating. And now I know it was all a lie." His lawyer leaned forward. "My client is prepared to discuss restitution for any financial damages." "This isn't about money," I said, cutting him off. "This is about truth. For 18 years, David let me believe I was a widow. Let our daughter believe her father killed himself rather than face his responsibilities. He stole our right to grieve honestly, to move on with our lives, to make our own choices about what we could handle." I turned back to David, who was staring at his hands. "You want to know what would have been easier, honesty? Telling me you'd fallen in love with someone else. Fighting for custody, dividing assets, going through the painful work of ending our marriage legally? I would have survived that, David. I might have even forgiven it eventually. But this I will never forgive." When I left Margaret's office that day, I felt like I'd been carrying a boulder for 18 years and had finally set it down. Not because David had apologized. His apology was weak, self-serving, focused more on his own suffering than mine. But because I'd finally said everything I needed to say to the man who'd shaped so much of my adult life through his absence. The legal proceedings continued for several more months. David pled guilty to insurance fraud and identity theft in exchange for avoiding jail time. He was ordered to pay substantial restitution, not just to me, but to the insurance companies he'd defrauded. His marriage to Jennifer was declared invalid since he'd never been legally divorced from me, which meant their children were now technically illegitimate in the eyes of the law. I felt bad for Jennifer and the kids who were innocent victims of David's deception, just as Sarah and I had been. I sent Jennifer a letter through Margaret explaining that I had no interest in pursuing any claims against her personally, and that my fight was solely with the man who'd lied to all of us. She wrote back a short note expressing her shock at learning about David's first family and her gratitude for my restraint. Sarah took the news better than I'd expected. She was angry, of course, furious at having spent her entire adult life believing her father had chosen death over facing his problems. But she was also relieved in a way to finally understand why their relationship had always felt incomplete. Why he'd seemed to be pulling away even before his disappearance. "At least now I know it wasn't my fault," she said during one of our long phone conversations after the truth came out. "I spent years wondering if I'd been a bad daughter, if I'd somehow driven him away. Now I know he was planning to leave the whole time." The hardest part was explaining to people in Millbrook what had happened. For 18 years, I'd been the tragic widow, the woman who'd lost her husband too young and carried her grief with quiet dignity. Now, I was something else entirely, the woman whose husband had faked his death to start over with someone else. Some people treated me with the same sympathy they'd always shown, understanding that I was as much a victim as anyone else. Others seemed almost disappointed that my tragedy had turned out to be someone else's crime. But their reactions mattered less and less as the months passed. I was too busy rebuilding a life that was finally completely my own. A year after finding David's anniversary card, I was sitting in my garden on a Sunday morning, drinking coffee and reading the newspaper in the sunshine. The attic had been cleaned out, completely transformed into a small reading room where I could escape with a book when the house felt too quiet. Sarah was coming to visit the following weekend, her first trip home since the truth about her father had come out. The phone rang, and for a moment my heart jumped the way it used to whenever an unexpected call came. But it was just the pharmacy confirming a prescription pickup. David was gone from my life in every way that mattered now. Not dead, but absent by choice, living with the consequences of his deception, while I lived with the freedom of finally knowing the truth. I thought about the woman I'd been 18 years earlier, the one who'd blamed herself for her husband's disappearance and spent decades making herself smaller to accommodate a grief that had been built on lies. She'd been a good woman, that earlier version of myself, but she'd been afraid of her own power, afraid of taking up space, afraid of demanding the truth, even when the lies were eating her alive. The woman sitting in the garden that morning was different. Not bitter or angry anymore, but clear-eyed and unashamed. She'd looked into the face of betrayal and refused to let it define her worth. She'd taken back her story from the man who'd tried to write her out of it entirely. She'd learned finally that being left behind wasn't the same as being worthless. David had given me an unwitting gift with his cruel anniversary card. He'd forced me to excavate the truth, to confront the lies I'd been living with, to reclaim the power I'd handed over to his memory. In trying to contact me again, he'd reminded me that I was still here, still standing, still worthy of taking up space in the world. I finished my coffee, folded the newspaper, and went inside to start planning the rest of my life. The real rest of my life, the part that belonged entirely to me.